The tide was climbing the wrong way. I felt it before I saw it, the way a man feels a wrong note in a song he has heard all his life. All my life I had heard the sea. It lived in my blood the way it lived in the blood of every king of Senreich before me. A low, endless roar behind the ears. A grinding of gray water on gray stone that never once, in 31 years, had gone quiet. My people called it the king's burden and spoke of it in soft voices, the way you speak of a wound that will not close. I had learned to rule with it, to sleep with it, to stand on my own high cliff, and hate the water that would not let me be. So when the roar changed that gray morning, when it stumbled and lifted and pulled, I was already moving before my guard had drawn a breath. I came down the cliff stair to Gulskar Cove, with my cloak snapping behind me and my wolf awake and straining under my skin, and I saw a thing that should not have been. The tide was inside the cove, not the ordinary tide that fills a cove twice a day and empties it again. This water had climbed past the rack line, past the drying nets, past the black stones where the gulls stood, and it was still climbing in a dead calm under a sky the color of pearl. There was no wind. There was no storm. The sea simply rose, smooth and swollen and wrong, up the shingle toward the crooked huts of the shore folk, and the folk were screaming and dragging their children and their boats up the slope, and the water followed them like something that had made up its mind. And in the middle of it, where the sea was deepest and the folk had fled, one girl stood still. She stood to her knees in water that had no business being there, in a plain gray shift with her dark hair loose and wet down her back, and she was not running. She had her hands open at her sides, just above the surface, and her head was tilted as though she were listening to someone speak her name. The water did not knock her down. The water did not pull her out. It rose around her and stopped, and where it touched her it went smooth as poured glass, and I stood on the shingle with my heart striking my ribs, and I could not understand what I was looking at. "Get her out," someone was shouting. An old woman, bent and frantic, gripping a coil of net with both fists at the water's edge. "Eloin, Eloin, come out of it, come away." The girl did not come away. She turned her head slow and looked back over her shoulder at the old woman, and her face was not the face of someone about to drown. It was calm. It was almost sorrowful. "It's all right, Mother Bryn," she said, and her voice carried across the still water clear as a struck cup. "It only wants to be near. It won't take anyone. It never has." And then the sea began to go down. It went down as strangely as it had come up, not in a rush, not in a wave, but as though someone very great and very old had drawn a slow breath and pulled the water back into their chest. It slid down the shingle, off the nets, off the black stones, back past the rack line to where a morning tide should sit, and it left the cove wet and steaming and silent, and it left the girl standing alone on the bare shingle with the whole gray sea lying quiet at her feet like a hound at heel. The roar in my blood was not roaring. I noticed it the way you notice in the dead of night that a clock you have heard your whole life has stopped. The endless grinding behind my ears, the burden, had thinned to a single clear tone, high and sweet and steady, one note held forever, and it was coming from the direction of the girl. I stood very still on the shingle of my own kingdom, and I listened to a quiet I had never once known. And my wolf, who had never in his life lain down for anything, lay down inside me and put his head between his paws and simply listened too. She saw me then. Everyone saw me. The shore folk went down on their knees in the wet shingle, and the old woman clapped a hand over her own mouth, and my guards came thundering down the last of the stair behind me. But the girl only looked at me across the drying stones with those calm, sorrowful eyes, and I saw her understand in one breath exactly who I was and exactly how much trouble she was now in. Because the shore folk of Senreich did not perform miracles in front of their king. The sea of Senreich was a grief and an enemy, mourned in every hearth, warred against on every cliff, and a girl who could make it lie down at her feet was not a wonder here. She was a witch, or worse. I saw her think it. I saw her weigh whether to run. "Don't," I said, My own voice sounded strange to me, low and careful, a man walking on new ice. "Don't run. I only want to know your name." "You heard it," she said. "Elowen." And then, because a shore girl does not speak plainly to a king unless she has already decided she is lost, "You're going to have me taken up, aren't you, for the sea?" "No," I said. I had not known I was going to say it until it was said. Behind me, my captain, Aldous, made a low sound of warning, and I understood him. I understood exactly what my council would say, what the priests of the drowned would say, what 200 years of a kingdom that hated the water would say, and I found that I did not care in the least. The single clear note was still singing in my blood where the roar had been. I would have knelt in the shingle to keep it. I had ruled Senreach for 11 years, and I had never once been at peace. And this drift girl in a wet gray shift had reached into my chest and stilled the whole sea, and no power on the cliffs of my kingdom was going to have her taken up. "You'll come to the keep," I said instead, "as my guest. Under my protection and no man's judgment but mine." I looked past her to the old woman with the net. "You too, mother, bring what she needs." The old woman's face worked. "My lord," she said, and stopped and tried again. "My lord, she's done nothing. She only gleans the shore. She's a good girl." "I know," I said, and it was the truth, though I could not have told you how I knew it. "Bring her." Elowen looked at me a moment longer. Then she bent, unhurried, and picked up the little sack of driftwood and salvage she had dropped when the sea came in. A shore gleaner's whole fortune. A few good planks and a coil of brass wire and a green glass float. And she slung it over her shoulder as though this were an ordinary morning. And she walked up the wet shingle toward me, and the crown of a kingdom that had every reason to fear her, with her chin level and her hands steady, and the sea lying still behind her. The note sang on in my blood the whole climb up the cliff stair. I did not tell her that. I did not tell anyone that. But I had lived my whole life inside a storm, and now a girl who owned nothing but a sack of driftwood walked up the stone stair beside me, and for the first time since I was born, it was quiet. They had a legend in Senreach that I had been taught to despise. Every child of the cove was raised on it, and every child of the cliff was raised to sneer at it, and I had been a child of the cliff. It was the legend of the drowned bell. 200 years passed, the folk said, before ever a king ruled from the cliff keep. The true seat of this coast had stood not on the high stone but out on a low tidal island in the mouth of the cove, a hall called Caer Morwen, white-walled and open to the sky, and in its tower had hung a great bronze bell that answered the sea. The line that ruled from Caer Morwen were the sea blessed, the folk said, the moon and tide line, and the water loved them. It came gentle to their shore, it filled their nets, it never took a child of the cove while a Morwen sat in the hall. And their bell, the deep bell, rang out over the water at every high moon, and the sea rang back, and there was no grief between the land and the water in all that age. And then in a single night, the sea rose and drowned them all. That was where the legend forked, and the forking was the whole of it. The cove folk told it one way, that a wickedness came to the coast, that men of the cliff coveted the sea-blessed hall and its bell and its love from the water, that on the night of a great springtide they cut the causeway and left the Morwen line to the rising sea, and the water climbed the white walls and swallowed the hall and every soul in it, and the deep bell went down still ringing and rang once, drowned, and never rang again. And the sea, the cove folk said, had grieved ever since. The sea had turned gray and cruel and hungry, and it took the cove's children and drowned the cove's men and gnawed the cove's cliffs, because the love had been murdered out of it, and it would grieve until the day a child of the drowned line came home to the shore and made the deep bell ring again. The cliff folk told it the other way, and it was the way I had been taught. There had been no wickedness, they said. There had been a foolish sea-witch line that trusted the water and would not build on high stone, and one night the sea did what the sea always does, which is drown the trusting, and the wise men of the cliff who had built high and strong survived to found a true kingdom on the rock. The bell was a story. The grief was a story. The sea was simply the sea, an enemy to be walled out and warred against, and any cove girl who spoke of the drowned line coming home was to be pitied or whipped, according to how much of her nonsense she made others believe. My own house had founded the Cliff Kingdom. My own ancestors were the wise men of the cliff who had built high and strong and survived. And the roar of the grieving sea had lived in the blood of every one of us from that night to this. And no man had ever once said aloud the thing I had understood, standing on the shingle at dawn, watching the water lie down at a drift girl's feet. We had been taught that the roar was the enemy at the wall, but a wound only roars because it wants to be closed. All my life the sea had not been threatening me. It had been calling, and I had been raised, generation on generation, not to hear it. I did not sleep that night. I stood at my high window above the black water with the single clear note quiet in my blood, and I looked out toward the mouth of the cove, where at the lowest ebb on the clearest nights, a man could just make out a dark rooftop breaking the swell, the drowned rooftops of Caermorwen, that the cliff folk called a reef and the cove folk called a grave. And I thought of a girl in a wet gray shift saying, "It only wants to be near," and I did not despise the legend any more. I had the reader brought to the keep the next morning. Vessa the reader was the oldest thing in Senrich and the only soul on the whole coast who was afraid of nothing, being blind, and being older than fear. She had read the tides for my father and for his, and she came up the stair on the arm of a boy with her milk-white eyes turned up to a sun she could not see, and she stopped in the middle of my hall and lifted her chin and went very still. "You've a Morwen under your roof," she said. The hall was full. My council was there, and my captain, and the priests of the drowned in their gray, and every one of them heard her, and every one of them made a sound. I raised my hand for quiet, and I did not get it, so I stood, and then I got it. "Say that again," I told her. "You heard me, Cliff King." She turned her white eyes toward the far end of the hall, where Eloin stood in a clean gray gown Mother Bryn had begged from the kitchens, small and straight and alone against the cold stone. I can smell the sea blessing on her from here. It's thin, Powers, it's thin, 200 years thin, one drop of it left in a whole barrel of common water, but it's there and it's true, and it's the only drop of it left in the world. That girl is the last of the drowned line. The sea knows its own. That's why it came up to be near her yesterday. It's been looking for 200 years, and it found her on your shingle. Lord Cadon of the Blackreef was on his feet before she had finished. He was the strongest of my council and the most ambitious, a broad, hard man who held the sea cliff south of the cove, and who had, for 3 years, been pressing me to a thing I would not do. "This is madness," he said. "A blind woman smells a cove witch, and we're to believe a drowned fairy tale." "My lord, the girl made the tide rise, that's witchery plain, and the priests have named the penalty for witchery since before your grandfather sat that chair. She should be." "Be careful," I said, "how you finish that sentence in my hall." He stopped. He was not a fool, but he was a wolf who had scented something, and he came at it from the other side. "Then set the fairy tale aside," he said, silky now, "and let us speak of the reef, Caermorwen." He said the name like a merchant naming a purse. 200 years it's lain out there in the mouth of the cove, and every soul on this coast knows the old hall went down with its treasury. The sea-blessed lines gold, their moon silver, the great bronze bell alone worth a war chest. I have men who can work under the water. I have petitioned this council 3 years running for the right to raise what's down there, and 3 years running I've been refused for a superstition. Now a cove girl makes the sea lie flat as a floor. He turned to the hall, playing them, and they leaned to him. And I say that's not a witch to be feared, my lord. That's a tool to be used. Put her on my barges. Let her calm the water over the reef the way she calmed it in the cove, and I'll bring up Caermorwen's gold in a season and fill this kingdom's coffers to the roof beams. That's the profit in your miracle. Not a Luna, a dredge. And the worst of it was that half the hall wanted it. I watched their faces. 200 years of grief and hunger and a hard coast, and here was a lord promising gold out of the grave that had haunted them, and a girl to be used to fetch it. I saw my council do the sum. I saw the priests of the drowned, who ought to have cried sacrilege, go quiet and thoughtful and greedy. I looked at Aloan. She had not moved through any of it. She stood against the cold stone with her hands folded and her chin level, and she looked back at me across the whole length of my hall, and she said quietly into the greedy hush, "You can't raise it." Kadon rounded on her. "It's not for a shore girl to." "You can't raise it," she said again, louder, and the hall stilled because a drift girl did not raise her voice in a king's hall, and this one had. "You can put 100 men under the water over Kaer Morwen and you'll drown everyone, and you'll wake the sea, and it will come up the cove the way it came up yesterday, except I won't be standing in it to ask it to be gentle. The bell down there rang once when it drowned, and it's been holding that one note for 200 years, waiting, and if you go down there with hammers and greed to break it up for bronze." She stopped. She had frightened herself with how much she suddenly knew. I watched her feel it, the knowing, rising up in her from somewhere she had never looked. "You mustn't," she said low. "That's all, you mustn't. It isn't gold down there, it's a grief. You don't dredge a grief, you answer it." The hall did not know what to do with her. Half of them were afraid of her again. Kadon's face had gone tight and dangerous, because she had named his scheme a grave robbing in front of the whole council, and she had done it well. And I stood at the head of my hall with the single clear note singing in my blood, and I looked at the last drop of the drowned line standing alone against my cold stone, telling a room full of powerful men that they must not break the thing that had been calling to my whole house for 200 years. And I knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with the quiet in my chest, that I was not going to let one hair of her head come to harm while I drew breath. "No one dredges Kaer Morwen," I said. "The petition is refused and it stays refused, and the next man to raise it answers to me. Lord Kadon, you may sit." He sat, but he sat the way a man sits who has decided to get up again later when the king is not looking, and I saw that too, and I filed it away. "And the girl," said Kadon's cousin oily from the benches, "if she's not a witch and she's not a dredge, what is she, my lord? What do you keep a cove girl in the keep for?" It was a trap, and I saw the whole shape of it, because there was a thing my council had been pressing on me for 2 years, a thing they wanted more even than Kadon wanted his gold, a marriage. A highborn Luna to seal the North Cliffs to the crown Lady Saril of the Cliffs, a cold, handsome girl of the cold, handsome cliff houses, whose blood was proper and whose alliance was worth a legion. They had a betrothal half drawn already. They had only wanted my yes. And now the whole hall was watching to see whether the Cliff King would say, plainly, that a drift girl was nothing to him, and put her out, and take the proper Luna they had chosen, or whether he would make a fool of his crown for a witch off the shingle. I looked at Aloan. She looked back at me, and she knew the trap as well as I did, and she did a thing I have loved her for every day since. She did not plead with her eyes. She did not beg me to choose her. She lifted her chin 1 degree higher, and she said to me, evenly, "I never asked to be kept, my lord. Say the word and I'll go back to my cove and glean my shore and trouble no one. You owe me nothing. I only came up the stair because you told me to." She gave me the door. She stood in a king's hall with a whole council hungry to be rid of her, and she opened the door and offered to walk out of it herself with her head high, so that I would not have to spend my crown defending her. And I found that I would rather spend my crown than let her walk through it. "You'll stay," I said, "because I ask it, not as a prisoner, not as a dredge, as a Loan who I would speak with. That is all the reason a king owes anyone." I turned to the hall and I let them see my face, and I have been told my face is not a gentle thing to see. And the next tongue in this hall that names her witch will be a tongue I remember. Vesa has read her true. She is the last of the sea-blessed line, and while she is under my roof she is under my honor. We are done. They were not done. I could feel that they were not done. Kadon's stillness, the half-drawn betrothal, the priest's gray greed, but they were dismissed. And they filed out, and the hall emptied, and at last it was only Eloin and old Vesa and me in the cold stone with the sea beyond the windows. Vesa turned her white eyes to me. "You hear it," she said, "not a question, the burden. It's gone quiet." I did not answer her, but an old blind woman does not need to be answered. 200 years your house has carried the roar of a sea that was murdered out of its love, she said softly. And the girl walks in and it goes still. Do you know what that means, Cliff King? Do you truly not know? She smiled, toothless and kind and terrible. The sea forgives your house through her. She's the door the grief walks out of. You can marry your cold lady of the cliffs and seal your legion and rule a kingdom that hates the water till the water eats it. Or you can do the thing your whole line was made 200 years too late to do. She turned to go on her boy's arm. You can bring a Morwen home to the shore. Your choice. It always was. I will not pretend to you that I courted her cleverly, because I did not. I was a king who had never in his life needed to be liked, and I had no arts for it. What I had was time, and a keep, and a girl in it who was as lonely as I was, and a quiet in my blood that grew a shade deeper every hour I spent near her, so that I began to arrange, clumsily, to be near her as often as a king could contrive. I found her most mornings at the sea window on the keep's low gallery, where the wall came down close to the water. She would sit with her sack of gleanings. She would not be parted from it, the driftwood and the brass wire and the green glass float, the whole of what she had owned, and she would sort it and mend it, and look out at the mouth of the cove, at the dark rooftop breaking the swell. You look at it every day, I said, the third morning, standing at her shoulder. So do you, she said, without turning. I've watched you at your high window at night. You look at it more than I do. I've hated it more than you do, I said. For a long time, my whole family hates it. It's in our blood, the roar of it. We call it the burden. It never stops. I heard myself and I stopped, because I had never said this to a living soul, and I was saying it to a drift girl over a sack of salvage. It stopped when you came up the shingle. I don't know how to tell you what that was. It has never once been quiet in me. And you walked out of the water and it went to one note, clear, like a held breath. I looked at the dark rooftop out on the swell, like a bell. She went very still. Then she turned on the window seat and looked up at me, and her calm face was, for once, not calm at all. You hear the bell, she whispered, the deep bell, the one they say went down still ringing. You hear it, now, in your blood. I don't know what I hear, I said. I never did. I only know that where the roar was, there's a note now, and it's you, and I would sooner lose my crown than lose it. She looked at me for a long time. There was salt on her lashes. I did not know if it was the sea wind or something else. My whole life, she said low, the cove has been afraid of me. Fish come to my nets when they come to no one's. The tide goes gentle where I walk. I found Mother Bryn's man's body when the sea took him, when 9 other men couldn't. I walked out at the ebb and it was just there, laid out on the sand for me, like the sea was sorry and wanted me to have him back to bury. They called me Sea-Touched. Sea Witch behind Bryn's back. My whole life I thought there was something wrong in me, that the water wanted, and it frightened me, and I made myself small so no one would see it. Her voice cracked and she mastered it, the way she mastered everything. And you're telling me you hear a bell? I'm telling you, I said, that there's nothing wrong in you. There never was. I think the sea's been looking for you your whole life. I think it's been looking for your line for 200 years. And I think it found you on my shore, and it's the truest thing that's ever happened to me, and I don't know what to do about any of it except stand near you and be quiet for the first time in my life. She put down the green glass float. She stood up slowly so that we were close, the drift girl and the Cliff King at the low sea window with the drowned rooftop out on the swell. You could tell me the rest, she said. The part your house doesn't tell in the hall, why the sea grieves. Why your family founded a kingdom on the rock and taught it to hate the water. You know it. I've seen it in your face since the hall. Tell me the true version, my lord. I think I've a right to it. I think it's mine. So I told her. I told her the thing my house did not say aloud. That the Cove folks' version was the true one, and the Cliff Folks version was the lie my ancestors had built to sleep at night. That 200 years ago the sea-blessed line had ruled from Kaer Morwen, and the water had loved them and the coast had been at peace, and that men of the cliff, my own blood, had coveted it. Coveted the love the water gave them, the full nets, the safe children, the bell that rang and the sea that rang back. And that on the night of a great springtide, when the sea was highest and the causeway to the island hall was a thread, my ancestors had gone out in the dark and cut it. They had cut the causeway and stove the boats and left the whole Morwen line to the climbing water, and they had stood on the cliff and watched the sea take the white hall and everyone in it, and heard the deep bell ring once, drowned, and go silent. And then they had come down at the next dawn, and named themselves kings of a coast whose true rulers they had murdered. And the sea knew, I said. The sea always knew. It knows its own, Vesa said so, and it's true. It knew the love had been cut out of it by wickedness, and it turned gray, and it grieved, and it hungered, and it put the roar of its grief into the blood of the house that did it, and there it stayed 200 years, generation on generation, roaring in us because we would not hear what it was saying. I looked at her, and I did not spare myself. My family drowned yours, Alowan. That's the true version. The bell you hear in me is the crime my house did. I'll understand if you can't stand to look at me now that you know it. She was quiet a long time. I don't hate you for a thing your grandfather's grandfather did, she said at last softly. I never met him. I met you. And you came down a cliff stair with your cloak flying to save a witch you'd never seen from your own sea. And you refused a gold-hungry lord and a proper marriage to keep a drift girl in your hall. And you just now told me the shameful truth of your own house, because I asked you for it, and you thought I had a right to it. She reached out, I felt it in my whole body, the single note swelling, and she laid her Saltruff Gleaner's hand flat against my chest, over the place where the sea had roared my whole life and now only sang. You don't answer a grief with more grief, my lord. I told your hall that. It's the truest thing I know. The bell isn't a crime. It's an unfinished thing. It rang once and it never got to ring back. That's all a grief is, a bell that rang once and never got its answer. She looked up at me, steady, sea-blessed, the last drop of a drowned line, with her hand over my quiet heart. Maybe your house and my line got put on the same shore 200 years too late so that we could finish it. Did you ever think of that? Maybe the sea didn't send me to your shingle to drown you. Maybe it sent me so the bell could finally ring back. I have been a king, and I have led wolves into battle, and I have stood on my cliff in storms that tore the roofs off the world, and I tell you plainly, I have never in my life been as undone as I was by a drift girl's hand over my heart, and the words the bell could finally ring back. The note in my blood was so clear and so full I could scarcely breathe around it. I put my own hand over hers and held it to my chest, and I said, lo, then we'll finish it. However it's done, whatever it costs my crown, we'll answer it together. I did not know then how soon the sea would ask us to. The springtide came at the dark of the next moon, and Kadon came with it. I should have watched him closer. I had marked him for a man who would get up again when the king was not looking, and I had let a girl's hand over my heart make me forget to look. He had not petitioned again. He had not argued. He had gone quiet, which in a man like Kadon is the loudest thing he can do, and while I was learning the shape of a drift girl's hands, he had been down at the Black Reef fitting out his barges and hiring his underwater men and waiting, patient and greedy. For the one night in the year the sea would let him get out over the drowned hall, the great ebb of the springtide, when the water pulled back farther than any other night of the year, and the reef of Kaer Morwen came almost bare to the sky. He meant to dredge the grave while it lay open, and he had timed it for the dark of the moon when he thought I'd not see the barges go out. But you cannot hide a springtide from a king with the sea in his blood, and you cannot hide it at all from the last of the sea-blessed line. Alowan woke me. She came to my chamber door white-faced in the dark with her hair down and her feet bare on the cold stone, and she said, "It's going out. My lord, wake up, the sea's going out. Farther than it should, faster than it should, it's pulling back off the whole coast, and it's wrong. It's the pull before the great rise, and there are lights on the water. Out over the reef. There are lanterns out over Kaer Morwen. I was at the window before she finished. She was right. The sea had drawn back off the cove till the shingle ran out and out into wet gray flats that had not seen the sky in a generation. And out at the mouth, where the drowned rooftops lay, there were lanterns. A string of them, barges, men, the small hard glint of iron catching torchlight, Cadon's dredge, out over the open grave on the one night the grave lay bare. And beyond the lanterns, out on the black horizon, the sea was coming back. I have seen storms. This was not a storm. There was no wind and no cloud. The dark of the moon lay clear and cold on a coast the sea had abandoned. But out past the reef, the water was rising in a long dark swell that ran the whole width of the world, silent and smooth and higher than any tide. And it was coming in, the great rise of the springtide, the once-a-year climbing of the water, the very tide that had drowned Kaer Morwen 200 years ago on a night just like this one. And it was coming in over 100 men who had gone out to break up the drowned bell for its bronze. He'll drown them all, I said. The fool. He's out over the grave with the great rise coming and he can't see it yet from the water. It's flat as glass out past the reef till it's on you. I was pulling on my boots, roaring for Aldous, for the horn, for every man on the cliff. Ring the alarm. Ring the cliff bells. Get the cove folk up the stair, the whole cove. The rise is going to come up the shingle the way it came up in front of you. Except this time, there'll be no one standing in it to ask it to be gentle. And Aloin said from the window in a voice gone strange and far away, "Yes, there will." I turned. She was looking out at the dark rising sea with the same calm, sorrowful, listening face she'd worn on the shingle the first morning, and the same knowing was rising up in her that had risen in the hall, except deeper now and surer and older than she was. "It's why it found me," she said softly. "It's why it waited 200 years and put me on your shingle, not to fill my nets, for this night. It's the springtide come round again, the same tide, and there are men out over the hall again, and the sea's coming in again to take them the way it took my line, and this time there's a Morwen on the shore to stand between." She turned to me, and there were tears on her face, and she was not afraid. "I have to go down, my lord. I have to go down to the water and answer it. It's the whole reason I'm alive." "No," I said. Every part of me said it. "Aloin, the last men who trusted that water on this night drowned, all of them, your whole line. The sea took them and it never gave them back. I will not stand on this cliff and watch it take you too." "It won't take me," she said. "It's not angry at me. It's never been angry at me. It's grieving, and I'm the answer to its grief, and it's been carrying that one note 200 years waiting for me to come and let it ring back. You told me that. You hear the bell. So did I. I've heard it my whole life and thought I was mad." She crossed the cold stone and took my face in both her salt-rough hands, and she made me look at her. "You said we'd finish it together, whatever it cost your crown. I'm holding you to it. Get the cove up the stair. Get the folks safe. And then you come down to the shore with me, Cliff King, and you stand with me while I do the thing my line was drowned before they could finish, and we ring the bell back. Together. That's the finishing. That's the only finishing there is." And powers help me, I believed her. Every warning in my blood and my bones and my crown screamed at me not to, and I looked into the eyes of the last of the drowned line, sea-blessed and unafraid with the great tide climbing behind her, and I believed her, and I chose her, and I have never once been sorry. "Ring the alarm," I said to Aldous without looking away from her. "Get every soul in the cove up the cliff stair and behind the high wall, every child, every net mender, every old woman, and you get Vesa, and you get my council, and you get Cadon's own kin, and you bring them all to the top of the stair to watch, because they are going to see this." And then I took a breath, and I took her hand, the drift girl's hand that had stilled the whole sea. "Then the king and the last of the Morwen line are going down to the shore, together, to answer the sea." We stood on the wet shingle of Gulskar Cove with the whole grieving sea rising in the dark before us, and above us, packed at the top of the cliff stair behind the high wall, the whole of Senreach watched, the cove folk and the cliff folk, the council and the priests. Old blind Vesa with her white eyes turned to a sea she could hear coming, and Lord Kadon, dragged up from his own barge landing by my guard, held between two of my wolves to watch what his greed had woken. Out over the reef, Kadon's dredgers had finally seen the rise, and their lanterns were fleeing, scrambling their barges landward, oars flailing, too slow, always too slow, and behind them the great dark swell of the springtide came on, silent and smooth and higher than the drowned rooftops, higher than the reef, a wall of grieving water 200 years deep, coming in to do again what it had done before. And Aloan let go of my hand and walked down the shingle to meet it. She walked out onto the wet gray flats the ebb had bared, out past the rack line, out toward the climbing sea, small and straight in her gray shift with her dark hair loose, and I walked one pace behind her with my heart in my throat and my whole kingdom holding its breath on the cliff above. She waded in to her knees, to her waist, and the great dark rise came on and reached her, and where it touched her, it went smooth. It went smooth the way it had gone smooth that first morning, glass calm and glass still, and it did not knock her down and it did not pull her under. It rose around her, and it stopped, and it held a wall of dark water higher than a hall, standing upright in the mouth of the cove around a drift girl who had lifted her open hands to it, and I heard her speak to it, low, the way you speak to a grieving thing you love. "I know," she said to the sea. "I know, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry it took so long. I'm here. I'm the last of them and I came home. You can stop now. You can put it down." And then weeping with her hands open on the black water, "Ring it back. It's all right. I'm here to hear you. Ring it back." And the sea, the whole grieving gray sea of Senrich that had roared in the blood of my house for 200 years, went down. It did not crash. It did not drown. It sank, slow and vast and shuddering like the greatest of all breaths finally let go, and as it sank it drew back off the mouth of the cove farther than any ebb had ever gone, farther than the springtide, farther than the world had seen in 200 years, and out in the mouth of the cove, streaming and black and terrible and beautiful, Kaer Morhen rose. The whole drowned hall rose out of the falling watcher. Not the reef, not the rooftop the folk called a grave. The hall, the white walls green-black with 200 years of the deep, the open courts, the drowned windows pouring seawater like tears, the streaming causeway that my ancestors had cut rising bare and whole out of the ebb. And above it all, streaming black, hung in its drowned tower for 200 years, the great bronze bell. Aloan turned back to me on the bared flats, weeping and laughing at once, and she held out her hand, and I went to her, the Cliff King walking out across the grave his fathers had made, to the last of the line they had drowned, and I took her hand. And together, the two of us, the two lines, we walked up the streaming bared causeway that had been cut 200 years before, into the drowned hall of Kaer Morhen, to the foot of the deep bell. It hung there black and vast above us, beaded with the sea, silent for 200 years, holding its one drowned note that had rung as the water closed over it and never once got its answer. "Together," she said, her hand in mine. "Together," I said. And we set our two hands to the drowned bell of Kaer Morhen, the sea-blessed line and the Cliff King, the murdered and the murderer's son, the grief and the answer to it, and we rang it. It rang. 200 years of silence broke open, and the deep bell of Kaer Morhen rang out over the mouth of the cove, one great bronze note rolling out across the bared flats and up the cliff and over the whole of Senrich, so deep and so vast that the stone shook with it, so full of 200 years of held grief and held love that every soul on the cliff stair above wept to hear it and did not know why, and in my blood, where the roar had lived my whole life, and the single note had sung since she walked up the shingle, the bell rang back. The sea and my blood and the bronze rang the one note together, land and water and wolf, the grief and the answer meeting at last after 200 years, and it was not a wound any more. It was a wedding. And the sea rang back. Out past the risen hall the whole gray sea lifted its voice in answer, not a wave, not a storm, a sound, a vast rolling toll of water answering bronze, the sea ringing back the bell it had drowned, the answer it had waited 200 years to give, and the two notes met over the mouth of the cove and became one, and where they became one the gray went out of the water. I saw it. The whole cove watched it. The grief went out of the sea of Senreach in a single rolling breath, and the water that had been gray and cruel and hungry for 200 years ran clear and gentle and green from the mouth of the cove to the black horizon, and lay down soft around the risen hall, and around the fleeing barges it had been about to swallow, and set them down gently on the bared flats without drowning a single greedy man. Because the last of the Morwen line stood on the shore, and while a Morwen stands on the shore, the folk say, the sea does not take a child of the cove. I turned to her in the ringing, streaming hall of her drowned house, the last of the sea-blessed line, and I did the only thing a king could do, which was to go down on one knee on the wet stone of Caer Morwen before the whole watching kingdom, and take her Saltruff Gleaner's hand in both of mine. Elowen, I said, and my voice broke and I let it. The sea sent you home to my shore. I don't care what my council wants, or what alliance I lose, or what the cliff houses say. I've heard the bell in my blood since the morning you walked out of the water, and I know now what it was you coming home, 200 years late, and it was my whole house's grief finally getting its answer, and it was this. I looked up at her, kneeling in her drowned hall with the clear green sea lying gentle beyond the walls. Come home the rest of the way, not as a guest, not as a dredge and powers no not as a witch, as my Luna, as the sea's own, come back to the shore. Let the finishing be a whole life, not one night. Marry me, and let our two lines be one line, and let there never again be grief between the land and the water on this coast. That's the crown I want. That's the only crown I want. Come home. She went down on her knees in front of me on the wet stone of her drowned house, so that we were eye to eye, the drift girl and the cliff king, in the ringing quiet after the bell. I've lived my whole life, she said, small so no one would see the thing in me that the water wanted, making myself less, being frightened of the truest part of myself. She was weeping and smiling, and her hand was steady in mine. And you came down a cliff stair and saw it the very first morning, and you weren't afraid of it, and you weren't greedy for it, and you knelt in my grandmother's drowned hall and asked it to come home. She lifted her free hand and laid it against my face. Yes, my king. Yes. I'll come home. I'll be your Luna and the seas, and I'll ring the bell with you every high moon of both our lives, so that no child of this coast ever grows up in a kingdom that's afraid of the water. Yes, take me home. I rose, and I raised her with me, and I turned us both to face the cliff, to face the whole of Senreach packed at the top of the stair, cove folk and cliff folk, council and priest and Cadon held between my wolves, and above us the risen hall streamed, and the clear green sea lay gentle, and the deep bell's last note still hung in the air, and I lifted our joined hands into the ringing quiet. And Senreach knelt. Not because I made them, I did not have to make them. The cove folk knelt to the last of the drowned line come home to save them. The cliff folk knelt because they had felt the grief go out of the sea in their own bones, and could no longer pretend the legend was a story. The priests of the drowned knelt to a miracle they had almost sold. And old blind Vesa knelt with her white eyes streaming, her whole long life's reading come true at last. Only Cadon did not kneel, and he did not need to. His greed had woken the tide that unmade him, and he stood shamed between my wolves while the kingdom he'd meant to fill with grave gold knelt to the girl he'd wanted to put on a dredge, and that was a fuller ruin than any I could have decreed. I have been asked since whether I feared what I gave up. The cliff alliance broke, of course. Lady Saryl's house withdrew to their cold cliffs, offended, and for a season there were hard looks in the north. Let them look. Do you know what I gained against a legion I did not need? The sea of Senreach runs clear and green now, from the mouth of the cove to the black horizon. The nets come up full. The cove has not lost a child to the water in the years since, not one, and the cliff folk have come down off their high rock and learned to fish the gentle water their grandfathers hated, And the two peoples that this coast kept apart for 200 years marry each other now, cove and cliff, the way the two lines married in me and my Luna, and there is no grief left between the land and the water in all of Senreach. We did not raise Kaer Morwen. Caeda never got his gold, and no one else will either. The drowned hall sank back under the clear water when the great ebb ended, back to its rest in the green deep, and it lies there now not as a grave but as a home the sea keeps gently, the way you keep a thing you love. But the deep bell we do not leave drowned. Every high moon, my Luna and I go down to the shore of Gulskar at the ebb, the two of us, alone, and Aloin lifts her open hands to the water the way she did the first morning, and the sea draws back off the mouth of the cove, gentle now, glad now, no grief in it, and lets the drowned tower of Kaer Morwen rise just far enough to bear the great bronze bell. And we set our two hands to it, the Cliff King and the sea-blessed Luna, and we ring it, and the sea rings back, and the one note rolls up the cliff and over the whole coast, and every soul in Senreach stops what they are doing, cove and cliff alike, and lifts their head to listen, and no one is afraid. The burden is gone from my blood. Where the roar lived my whole life, there is only ever the one clear note now, and it is not a wound and it is not a grief. It is a bell that finally got its answer, and it sings in me quiet and whole all my days, and it is her. Last high moon I stood on the shore with my Luna's hand in mine, and the bell's answer rolling out over the clear green sea, and she looked up at me and said, "Lo, you still hear it, don't you? In your blood." "Every hour of my life," I said, "the clearest thing I know." She smiled, the drift girl who owned nothing but a sack of gleanings, and turned out to own the whole reconciled sea. "Good," she said, and put her head against my shoulder, and we stood a long while and listened to the water we had both been born to, ringing back to us at last across the years, the two of us the answer to 200 years of grief. At home on the same shore the sea had drowned and forgiven. And the bell of Kaer Morwen, that slept 200 years, rang on gentle and glad over the cove, and neither of us ever tired of hearing it.